Hi, my name is Eva Steiner, and this is my project Psychotherapists Around the Globe. I am interviewing the psychotherapists around the world and asking them the same 8 questions. I am wondering how mental health profession is in their country. Today we are going to. Thank you for taking this time for doing this interview with me. Before we start, can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Hi, so my name is Kazin from Singapore. So yes, I'm a psychotherapist, also a psychologist by training. So I work across different age groups, from the little ones, the young ones, to the seniors as well. So really glad to be here with you today.
Tell me a little bit about your culture. What is some holiday or tradition that your country celebrates? And if your culture would be an emotion, what emotion would it be?
I'm from Singapore, so I think when I was reflecting upon this question, the thing that comes to my mind is that actually Singapore is a very diverse personality, I would say. And I use the word personality because there's just so many cultures, so many different races, we've got different nationalities coming together. But then again, I was reflecting upon it and I was just thinking it's quite similar across different countries around the world because we've got globalization going around. But for my country, I would really say that we have a very diverse culture. And the unique point of it, I think, would be that we celebrate so many different festivals because of that. So if you even pop by Singapore, December to February, you'll find yourself, a day where it's Christmas. And then within 5 days from like 1st of January, suddenly we've popped into, say, Chinese New Year decorations. And I think that's really that moment that came to my mind when I was thinking about this question, because there's really an appreciation of different cultures here. And, you just keep celebrating New Year's at different time of the year because we've got the Malay New Year's, the Indians, and then we've got Chinese, and then of course major Western culture influence, the festivals that come by. The difficult question for me was the emotion actually. I was trying to find like one English word that could really sum up, our country as a whole, and because it's so diverse, right? And in the end, I actually didn't find an English word. I actually don't think it's in the dictionary, but it's a very Singapore lingo that I would like to introduce today that's very unique to our culture, where we've got two emotions that actually came to my mind. So the first one is actually shook. And I don't know whether we've heard about it before, but shook in itself can encompass so many positive emotions. One way that I could use it, for example, that I'm hearing from the clients sometimes is like, I think 2 months ago, Taylor Swift came by our country for a concert. And I hear them describing, oh, the concert was so shook. In this word shook, it could mean like you're just very satisfied, you're very fulfilled, you feel very relaxed, you feel really glad, you feel really happy. So it's really one word with many different emotions in it. But that will be the more positive emotion that it encompasses. On the other hand, so of course there's the other side of it where the word that came to my mind for Singaporeans would be the word what we call sian. And I think it's a bit of a Chinese word that became a bit more of a Singapore lingo where it just means that things are kind of boring, a little flat, there's nothing that quite interests you. So if I had to think of a couple of words to describe the emotion for Singaporeans, yes, we toggle between quite extremely between shook and then we have the sian, which is the kind of boring. I'm just not feeling it today.
Can you maybe give me some examples of boring? In what way?
Well, I guess it's when things are kind of routine. If I really had to think of an English word, then the word that came to my mind, we talk about emotions or mood in general. I would say Singaporeans, personality wise, perhaps at large, maybe a little bit more on the practical side of things. So, very much, with the efficiency, the effectiveness, to a certain extent, a little bit more outcome driven per se. So, when things perhaps don't move in the direction that they want it to be, or it's not quite aligned with the needs, that's where the emotion of sian, in this case, boredom, it's not moving the way I want it to be, but I kind of have to do it anyway. So I actually hear it from the seniors, the older population, and then, of course, the middle, and then even the young ones use it. So I thought, oh, that's really a word that I guess Singaporeans from different ages can relate to at different points.
How did you become a psychotherapist in your country, and what is your therapeutic approach?
It was quite a journey, I must say. I mean, relatively, I think Singapore is still a very young nation, so we don't have very established framework or structure of becoming a psychotherapist. So for myself, I think that journey probably began 10, 13 years ago. This is my 10th year being a psychotherapist per se, because I was a bit different for myself because I started within the private practice. So I would say that within, say, local hospitals, the larger government organizations, there's definitely different frameworks. But even then, you will see different frameworks depending if, say, you're in the medical side of things versus the education sector. So for myself, because I started within the private sector, the first 2, 3 years when I was reflecting on this question, it's really quite a blur for me. In fact, I felt that there was a lot of, I would term it as firefighting, because there's no clear cut, say, client population that comes through to the private center that I used to work with. So a lot of my work was very dependent on to say what the lead psychologist was working on, who I was supporting and shadowing in terms of psychotherapy intervention. So first 2, 3 years, I would say much more so in terms of the children, children therapy. I was supporting as a behavioral therapist at that point in time. So that was how I started. But along the way, there were so many other parts to a child, right? The emotions, and all that. And I just felt like there was just so much in me that I wanted to support, but very much inadequate. So the first 2, 3 years, I think the main turning point came for me when I started taking upon, say, play therapy. So therapeutic play per se, that really expanded my therapeutic toolkit. But then again, so went back to that, did that for 2 years, and I was like, okay, so in Singapore, with the other form of therapy, we normally refer it to as like talk therapy, so counseling approaches. And that was where, because again, back in private setting, had to work with adults as well. Actually, back then, I started with cognitive behavioral therapy for adults, actually. So went back, did that, and I was like, still something lacking for myself. So that was where I went into more so CTRT, so choice theory, reality therapy. So two main points, one with play therapy, one with CTRT, really define how I approach cases from then on. Because with play therapy, I think it was really different from when I was being more so of a behavioral therapist per se. Because with behavioral therapy, I think the degree of directiveness in the work was very different versus with play therapy. I think the first thing they introduced, the idea was the idea of non-directiveness. So to me, it was almost like a culture shock. I was like, oh, you don't really set the target behavior and then so-called the intervention plan that goes with it. In fact, there's that belief there, the primary principles there where they say the belief that the child can take the lead in the session. So that was really different for myself. And I must say it is still something that influences my work, even in case conceptualization and things like that. Because then now I'm seeing more so as the client, child or adult or otherwise, in that case where they are the ones that can lead the change, and I'm there more so of empowering role. So with the play therapy, I think then we delve into things like creative work, expressive work. So there's the narrative, there's the, role play and things like that. And that really helped me see, beyond talk therapy, what are other ways that I can use to support the clients. And then, of course, fast forward a few years down the road, working with more adults. So then I went to CTRT, which was also, I felt, a really good combination with the CBT framework that I already had. Because with CTRT, I think there was the emphasis on the individual also as a person of change, the behavior driven by their internal needs and the motivation. And as psychotherapists, then my role was to help them find what are the needs that has not yet been addressed that stops them from, say, achieving the ideal picture of how they want things to be.
And in general, in Singapore, do you need a psychology education to then go work in the clinic, or can you go directly work in the clinic and gain experience, and this is how you learn?
So I think, again, very different within the public and the private setting. There's really good shifts going along in terms of our profession in Singapore right now. So there's much more regulation going on. I think back then, where there was that lack of pathway and structure as well, if you are in the, of course, government sector per se, there will be certain pathways. So you might go on to be an educational psychologist per se, and there's certain steps, they start within, say, I think associate psychologist, and they have clear frameworks as to how you go about doing it. But within private setting, then there's a lot, I would say, personal awareness. You need to know where your limits are and then, work on it. And of course, it's also very much dependent on your supervisor per se, the kind of practice or the kind of therapy that they use. Then of course, that's how they might supervise our work a little bit more. Typically, then there might be the direction that you take, right? But I think here and now, I would say there's definitely much more regulations in place. There's a lot more government efforts in terms of like platforms and structures as to mental health profession per se. So the more clarity, I would say, in this last, I would say after post-COVID. I think the post-COVID time, I think COVID times revealed a lot of needs within our mental health area and mental health support in Singapore as well. So since then, it's been really good changes, but still developing. Yeah. So in Singapore per se, say being a psychotherapist or counselor per se, I think in the last 2 years, so you definitely need to at least have an undergraduate degree, and depending if you continue say with a master's or a postgraduate diploma per se, it allows you different levels of membership. So there's definitely much more regulation in terms of the counseling framework at this point in time. Psychologists as well. I think psychotherapy, I think, is a bit more of a gray area because I think they're still deciding whether it goes under what they put as the allied health framework. So I think that's the part where there's still quite a bit of confusion going on, unfortunately.
How society looks upon psychotherapy or any psychological help?
Similarly, there's a shift after or during the COVID period, I would say, because I think more individuals were willing to come forth to seek help. And I think the needs became more apparent. And of course, with our society, there's of course a little bit of a challenge of the aging population as well. So a really encouraging shift, I would say, in the last 4 or 5 years in my practice that I see there are more senior populations coming through. In the past, typically, unless it's something that they have a physical complaint of, with mental health, not so much, I must say, but the openness, in seeking help in terms of psychosomatic complaints now, or even issues where sleep or anxiety or some mood depressiveness, we definitely see a shift there. So I would say that the general public is definitely much more open towards psychotherapy or seeking psychological help, even with the older population per se. This movement or shift occurred younger for the younger population. So for the children and the teens, adolescents, I would say 5, 6 years ago, there was already increasing openness there. And I think, again, that's so much associated with that. The idea in terms of the government efforts there was that you need a whole village to raise a child. So I think 5 or 6 years ago, they started many initiatives like the SG and ABLE, which is like a platform for special needs population within Singapore as well. And that really opened up the idea of, seeking help for be it mental health issues or, special needs education per se, that really changed things for us.
And before COVID, what was the general climate toward mental health?
There was a very mysterious air, I must say, surrounding, say, psychotherapy, counseling, or even psychologists. I mean, to this day, there's still the common question that I get, any difference between what you do and a psychiatrist? I think one most easy way to look at it is that I'm called a variety of titles. I can be called, my name's Kasin, but I'll get like Dr. Kasin. I'll go like, no, not a doctor. Or I'll be called Teacher Kasin by some of the young ones. And I'm like, I wouldn't quite say I'm a teacher. I'm rarely called like a psychologist or a counselor or psychotherapist per se, but I have a whole list of other things that people call me. So I think 5, 6 years ago, definitely before COVID, it is still something that sometimes there's some stigma that's attached to it. The common idea that comes to people's mind when they think about mental health or psychotherapy per se are actually more so of these psychiatric concerns. So things that, maybe might be perceived on more, I'd say, more intense needs per se. The extent of needs, would be a little bit more terrifying for the general population. I think it was only in the last 2, 3, 4 years, I think the younger population, I think with social media and all the exposure, the younger population has really stepped up. Nowadays, I can have my little ones, 7, 8-year-olds, come in and go, oh, my school talked about, depression today, ADHD today, and that's a really nice shift. I think they've incorporated it into like typical school assembly. So in the morning, they talk about it so that there's less stigma associated with it as well. I think one moment that comes to my mind is that I was supporting a little one, actually not little one, she's a teen. He does singing. So he was just telling me one day that he was busking along the streets, just where my private practice is. So I was like, okay, I'll go watch, right? Go see. And it was so surprising. I think I still feel really glad about it. Is that I went down. I was just wondering how I would introduce myself if I bump into him and his friends, because my idea is typically I wouldn't say that I'm a psychotherapist. I'll just be there to support. And this child, I mean, he really surprised me. He just told his friends, oh, that's my therapist. And then I'm like, oh, hi, And the other young ones were so supportive. So they're probably 14, 15. And they were like, oh, hi, can you have a chat with me? I think I need some help on this and that. And I was like, oh, and it's really nice because I remember back in my time when I was 14 and 15, definitely there wasn't this form of openness that was going around. So it was a really nice moment to see, for the younger population being much more open to that. And I think the society at large is also shifting.
What were some mental health stigmas in the past?
I think because of the lack of understanding of mental health in general, and of course the implications it might have because of that mysterious part where they also don't know what the psychotherapy say entails. So it will be seen as perhaps this person being having impaired judgment per se. So much more serious issues are perceived. If somebody says that they are feeling a little bit down or depressed, then there's of course that connotation of something being very wrong with an individual, because it's also something that you can't really define concretely, right? Mental health is not something you can really see. So in fact, there's also, even till today, I think there's some slight stigma there is that when people share, or sometimes when the teens share, right, they say, I'm really stressed out. And the response they get sometimes is, oh, but you're doing so well in school. Why you're doing so well? You look so okay, And the teens, the most direct bunch that you'll get, and they will just go, just because I look okay doesn't mean I'm fine, I'm trying to keep up with things. I'm trying to look okay, right? I think that's the part where there's still some slight misconception there. I think sometimes people need to see something to believe that exists, right? So I think with mental health, that has always been the challenge, which also then makes it hard for some to assess psychotherapy and support because then they are deemed as you don't seem like you need help.
What is your society teaching about child-parent relationship, and whether this value of society also influence how you design your interventions as a therapist?
There's a lot of shifts in our society at present, and I think we are in that crossroads, I think, between generations. So we've got the younger parents, and then the older generation. So the older parents, I think the younger generation, younger parents are actually, perhaps their parents would belong to the older generation of parents that we're looking at. And they really form two ways. So I think the first way with the older generation that, again, not a sweeping statement that I want to make, but typically a little bit more on the top-down approach where we think about a child and parent relationship. And I was just thinking it might be a little bit more on, I would say, an Asian mindset where it's a little bit more authoritative, I would say. And now what's happening is that now children from these parenting relationships have children of their own, and that's where I see really a big shift, right? Which of course sometimes cause a little bit of tension between the grandparents and the parents because they have such different points of view. But it's a good shift again. Even with the senior population, I think they are seeing how having a bit more of an open communication. With the young parents, I think I really see a lot of them wanting to have more of a friendly relationship, a more equal relationship with the child. That also comes from when I hear from them, what they're saying is that they've seen how perhaps some of the more authoritative approach didn't work for them and they want change. So I think that's the most important part again. And because there's these two parts, or two ways of looking at parenting relationship or child-parent relationship within our society, then it definitely affects how we interact with the parent, which in this case, for some of the parents who tend to still take a little bit more of the authoritative approach, at times they would still be the one. So when we say the child takes the lead, right, it would probably come position that to them that way because they still perceive certain needs that need to be met, or they want it to be positioned, or the goals of therapy to be positioned in such a way that may not be exactly what the child needs at times. And I think similarly, it also influences how the parent can continue the support in terms of the child's intervention at home. Also with maybe how our society perceives certain things and wanting a quick solution sometimes, they will also expect psychotherapy to have very quick results. So it's so how many sessions, So it's a common question we get still. So do I have to come back again? In fact, some of them are like, it's almost like they've seen the doctor for flu, right? So do I have to come back for another time? Or do you do the work and then at home it's just okay, I just continue with what I'm doing? So I think that comes with a lot of changes that's going the right direction, but still more changes needed. Yeah, so it definitely affects how we design the intervention sometimes because I think it also depends on what the parent is ready for with the child. So I might find, for example, that the child might need a little bit more of that supportive framework, maybe less so on, the outcome driven, maybe more so on the process. But the mentality has not yet shifted to the extent where parents might be a little bit more focused on the outcome. Of course, we have to do the little balancing act there between parent and child, per se.
And can you tell me more about these outcome-driven parents? Can you tell me more about from where this is coming from?
For the outcome-driven part of things, again, I think back in our first question where we were exploring like the personality of our society, right? The emphasis on, efficiency. So we want fast results sometimes. We want a bit more, I would say, practical mindset that we have, right? We want things that change, if it's not working, let's fix it. So it used to be really a trigger of mine where parents would come in and they would say, "Now, can you fix this problem? Can you fix this child?" Oh, that really triggered me in my first couple of years. And I'm like, there's nothing wrong. We have to switch the behavior, but let's not fix the child per se. When we start working with more parents, I think the part that I find most heartening is that as long as the parent is willing to be involved, I think there's definitely a way to kind of work or calibrate our therapeutic approaches to one that actually suits the parent and that family. I think that's the part where as long as the parent presents himself or herself, I think the other really good shift I'm seeing, there's more daddies, so more of the fathers bringing children down for intervention. I must say that when I first started, most of the time, I would say I'll have more contact with the mummies per se, but there's definitely a shift there. So with, daddies bringing the young ones down as well, they're also definitely much more involved in terms of the intervention at home than I would say 8-9 years ago.
And one more question, even adult client would come to you and say, I don't want to see my parents anymore, I want to cut contact. How would that be looked upon in your society, and how would you approach?
Culturally, I guess it's a very different perspective, especially in Singapore, I guess, because I think I've also heard from overseas clients per se where, by a certain age, they've moved out. Whereas in Singapore, it's still very much common, say, for a child, even with their own family, we've got grandparents and parents staying together, right? So where that happened, I think the first time where I had someone tell me that, I think it's also our own personal beliefs as a therapist that comes into a play where we go like, oh, that's not quite okay. But, that's my need. That wouldn't be my client's need. So at that point, I remember having a little moment of conflict in my mind where I go like, why? But that why really didn't come from the client's needs and perspective, but more so of my own beliefs. I had to calibrate that a little bit. But yes, we still have clients that come forward with those concerns. And of course, culturally, that would not sound most common. But then again, if I recalibrate and look at what the client's needs are presenting, then yes, there are times and moments where perhaps, I guess the perspective I take when that occurs is that if the client needs, especially if it infringes on safety, whether it's physical or emotionally wise, right? Then yeah, there is a step that needs to be taken. So it really took a while for me to calibrate and learn how to then manage that with the clients as well.
What are the learned beliefs regarding client-therapist relationship, and can the relationship continue outside the therapy once the therapy process is over?
I think this was the one where there was a very clear answer that came to my mind immediately. I would believe that the general perception is no. Personally, not so much for myself as well. But, giving it second thought, I think typically, across the board, we will say because of the dual relationships and all that, it's hard to manage. And I can't quite see how the relationship can continue once the therapy ends. If I relate it to the earlier questions, then it's that because the perspective of society on, say, psychotherapy is still developing. So there's still to a certain extent, I guess, in any society, still a certain sense of stigma, and we never know whether the client is ready to share that they have, a psychotherapist that they are working with per se. Even outside, sometimes we bump, because Singapore is such a small country, we definitely bump into our clients sometimes. Just pretend that we don't see them unless they acknowledge us. So I think that's the part where I would say, personally, I wouldn't think that the relationship can continue. Few exceptions to that, I would think, also because for some forms of therapy per se, so if you look at education, speech, behavioral therapy, I think when we are working with the young ones, I think sometimes the young ones just get really attached, to the therapist as well. And when that happens, I'm not sure whether this is available in other parts of the world, but in Singapore, we have a lot of academic tutors. So some of these tutors, so they're purely academic focused, right? So the teaching and all that. They actually form, tutors wise, they have very close relationships with the child. So family, it's almost like they're friends then. And I think sometimes the lines are great because of that. So if you look at education, behavior, speech therapists, I would believe that some parts of that therapeutic relationship can go beyond even after therapy ends. But I think for myself, when we look into more sort of psychotherapy, the emotion part of things, counseling, I find it really hard personally to see the client in another form of relationship outside of the therapeutic relationship. I would say it's quite a learned belief because I was just reflecting all the different supervisors that I worked with, and I would say that most of them, the idea that I got from them, the beliefs I got from them was that not so much. Yeah.
And what are maybe some misconceptions that the client have regarding psychotherapy, psychotherapeutic relationship? You mentioned doctor, that sometimes they call you doctor. What are other maybe misunderstandings?
Yeah, so there's still, of course, the common question is always psychologist versus psychiatrist. Do you guys work on the same? So it's like work on the same area, but different ways of working with it, I guess. And yeah, teachers. I think the other thing is that because when we support the young ones, the most, I guess, common role that comes to mind is teacher. So we often misperceive as being a teacher. And I think with the younger population, per se, I think with social media, it's actually really easy to, just find us online, or LinkedIn. It's a very fine balance there. So I do have an email at my center. So sometimes the teens do drop emails when they have challenges, when they have problems, or of course some common misconception is, oh, can I have your personal number, things like that. So that's pretty clear cut. But with social media nowadays, I think that's the part that I would say in the last 8-9 years we really had to think more about, because we also don't want that to become a way where they might look for us and we're just not there, right? And it might be a moment of crisis and that becomes challenging to manage. But perception wise, I think, again, it's a fine line. So the teens would typically see us more as friends. I would say it's not a bad thing to have that for the client therapist rapport between us. But at some point, then how do we not let that become almost like a crush, per se? Or they're used to kind of leaning upon us so much so that it's no longer empowering them. So that I would say is still a daily thought that I have in my mind, especially when I work with the younger population. The concerns that sometimes we might have is where the young ones become quite attached. Because sometimes we work with young ones coming from very troubled family relationships. So on that note, then sometimes even with the parents, then they might perceive us as, oh, so if I have an issue, I'll drop you a call, that kind of things, right? And it's toggling between wanting to be supportive versus not causing the client to then feel actually less empowered because of our actions.
And in general, is there any law for psychology and or psychotherapy in Singapore or not yet?
I would say that there are regulations. I wouldn't think that there's any strong legislations or law per se yet, but they've really been stepping up on it in the last 2 years. So that's really encouraging. I think it comes in line with there's a government movement action of wanting to increase the number of mental health professionals. In fact, I think there's a new course that's coming out later this year, just to meet that gap and that need of our population. So I'm not surprised if we're going to have something along, and that will be a really, really good change.
Okay, the 6th question, is supervision a must for a therapist in your country?
At this point in time, for therapists, in Singapore especially, it's still very much dependent on the professional licenses. So the professional organization they got the therapeutic license from. So say a speech therapy, depending on where they get their training from. And it's still very much based on that benchmark as to, say, if you were to renew your license, do you need supervision? Then it's still based on that. For outside, I think for psychologists, I would say in the past year, a major change did happen. So supervision is now a must. Prior to that, it's really more on your own discretion, how frequent, how much you do that. And I think starting from last year, they had a very sound framework. It's still developing. So there's still things that they are changing along the way. Again, a really good step in the right direction.
And what are the most common complaints that the client come to therapy for?
So I think, again, that depends on the population, the age population. So for myself, because I work across the developmental lifespan, senior-wise, I would say the older population typically come in, say, for physical complaints. I think that's still the most common one. And typically they'll be brought in by a family member who suspect that the physical complaint. So typically they will have gone through, say, the medical route and they can't find a reason, say, with the gastrointestinal or the difficulties falling asleep at night or the tension headaches. And then we are probably the second place that they go to and they go like, oh, are there any psychological issues underlying it? Any need for psychotherapy? So more so of the psychosomatic complaints for the older generation. I think most of the time where the adults come in, those that I'm seeing would probably present with some more often work-related stress, or stress with perhaps family relationships, marital stress per se. So more so relationship or work. And the common complaints that they come in will be more so on the anxiety and depression. And those are the, I would say, mental health needs that are slowly becoming more, I would say, clearer for people to understand. In fact, back in, I think, really COVID year, where I start hearing people ask me things like, what is high functioning anxiety? What is high functioning depression, right? And suddenly the term functioning was thrown into the limelight and people are starting to understand, oh, if something affects me in terms of my day-to-day functioning, there's actually ways such as psychotherapy, counseling to help with that, rather than just trudge along with that. Or and still almost, trying to work through it yourself is last time I would say seen as a sign of strength. I think that goes back to the part about certain stigma associated with psychotherapy in the past. Yeah. Again, for the young ones, we'll say, yes, it comes a little bit more so in terms of behavior. So where we see changes in behavior, I think learning, the common conditions that myself, I would say, will probably more so in terms of ADHD, ASD, learning needs. So more so neurodevelopmental conditions. And that, is also kudos to, the pediatricians, the doctors, the teachers, much more knowledge and awareness about that. So we are really seeing the age of, say, early intervention and referrals come in earlier now than in the past. It'll be quite a later age where they come in. And yeah, so I would say quite different depending on the age population and client population that we see.
And you mentioned before, if I understood you correctly, that maybe Singaporeans, you are more on a practical side. So it made me wonder, how are you regarding the emotions, regarding displaying sadness, displaying anger, displaying happiness?
Yeah, so with the part on anger, I think I giggled was because with the young ones, the most common complaint I actually, now that you mentioned, the most common complaint that I receive is anger management issues. And it's really interesting. I can have a teen come in, anger management issues, and eventually after all the clinical interview, a little bit more on the depressive side of things, versus I can have a child come in, oh, anger management issues, but actually maybe some slight concerns of attention deficit that we might have to explore further, right? So I think when you asked that question, what came to my mind was maybe because in our culture as well, to a certain extent, I wouldn't say it's as intense as say maybe in the Japanese or Korean culture, but showing anger, I think we're still to a certain extent conflict avoidant. We don't want to show that side of ourselves that we're not feeling good. Even 4-5 years ago, I'll still hear my little boy saying, "Oh, it's not okay for me to cry because that's not okay, right? That's not being strong." So this few years really big changes again, but the part on anger management is one word that we often receive during our initial calls, when it comes in and we're like, oh, anger management, but when we dig deeper, it's actually not so much. And I think it does show that to a certain extent, we are still, again, society that's developing in terms of the readiness to show how we feel. I think a lot of that has got to do with our Asian roots as well, where it's not so okay to show the not so good side of us. We just want to try to keep a little bit more composed and controlled per se. So it does affect some of the young ones in terms of their expression and of course the teens as well.
And how is perceived if you show not so good side of you, in a sense like what you're not so strong, you mentioned, or what is the perception?
I think within the individual themselves, especially with some of the older children, teens per se, it really at times creates a lot of anxiety. So when they actually feel anger, or even the sense of not feeling so good or, disagreeing with a viewpoint, they're actually not, at times, not so ready to actually share about it because they are worried that it might be perceived as something that is not being quite friendly, kind of breaking up that dynamic and that harmony and that peace in that moment. So I think individually it's still something that affects some of the young ones. I think outwardly, then of course, it might also be up in terms of the adult population to a lot of pent up stress Because then there's also that perception when I'm hearing from some of the parents that they try not to show that side of their emotions to the young ones as well, because of course, naturally, I don't want to burden them. So all good there. It's only that on the other hand, what comes back is that the young ones also then feel that they can't show that. So a lot of times when we are working with a family, or sometimes the parents will refer and come and say, oh, but the young ones, they can't seem to really express how they feel. And when we work a little bit deeper with the family, then we realize, oh, daddy and mommy aren't quite comfortable in showing that side of themselves as well. So definitely we can see how that has kind of affected, both with the young ones and the older ones as well.
If you would share one tool, belief, or approach that is a must-have for you as a therapist, what would that be?
Having a hard time picking between, the two key moments for myself, but eventually I think for myself it will be that moment where in play therapy, this set of principles that was one of the first things that really opened up my mind about psychotherapy. And one of the principle, or rather a belief that I would really hold on to now, is that we believe that even for a child, right, we think that the child needs a lot of support. On the other hand, the child can lead the way, and the therapist is actually just following the way that the child is showing us that he or she needs to be supported. And the other principle that came to my mind when I was reflecting upon this question was that we believe that the child has an innate ability to solve his or her problems. And we actually just need to give the child the opportunity to do so. And it's not, the therapy coming down saying, oh, you need to do this, you need to change this, right? Initially, also for myself, when I heard about play therapy and I chose to do it per se, I was also wondering, okay, so that's for children. I can't apply that for adults. But I guess like with any good, tool that met in our whole practice, I start applying upon it for myself as well, or even in conversation with others. And the part of it about having that respect for the client's ability to solve his and her problem, where my role is really just more sort of empowering, of trying to help the client find maybe the direction that he or she wants to be. And sometimes where we get stuck in session, then there's of course still the urge, maybe that's from my Singaporean blood, right? Okay, how do I make this move a little bit faster? I think that is still something that reminds me to, slow down, calibrate, trust the process. I think that's another term that comes to my mind, is that all these things would add up to the eventual picture that the client will need to be. So I think that's really with play therapy, although name-wise it sounds like it's just for the young ones. But, if I might share a quote that I really like from one of the books I've read in the past, is that, all adults were once children, but few of us remember it. And I really think that some of the principles that I've gotten from play therapy has really helped me in terms of my client work, psychotherapy, or even as a psychologist per se.
And from the society perspective, how this like trust and following align or doesn't align with the culture?
Now that you mention, not so much really. No, I think that's the part where there's again definitely change that's going on. I think there's a greater inclination to listen to the child, give the child the voice that he or she needs to also develop her confidence and sharing per se. But you're definitely right, it wasn't easy. I think back then when I first did play therapy, it was even surprising. I think how we position it to the parents really matter as well, because it was really surprising for if the parent was to hear us say, oh, we'll let the child lead the way and we just follow the way, and parents are coming in with of course, with a fair amount of anxiety, also needing a problem to be solved, or certain problem behavior to be managed. Then we're like, okay, we'll let the child lead the way, But I think along the way, it's really also then, I think initially we might be, I would say for myself, I might be a little bit more directive in terms of giving the parents some direction. At least they feel a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more so, I would say, assured that there's a direction there. But I think I would say these principles really more so for us in session, when we relate to the child or even individual. Another part that came to my mind was that with play therapy, what I realized with that even in conversation with people, I start realizing how it's important also to, actually allow the other party to share their ideas, instead of me jumping in with an idea or, a perspective. So that's definitely something that from the societal point of view, it's not the most common thing that comes to the mind, to allow the child to take the lead, but definitely much more so in the recent years, where we allow the child to have their voice as well. So in line with many changes. Yeah. So when I was reflecting upon the questions that we had for today, I think one thing that came to my mind was really there's a lot of changes going on in our mental health landscape in Singapore, really, for psychotherapy as well.